I'm looking forward really to this great discussion we have today. I'm joined by my colleague Bhavin from Portworx and Peter from Red Hat. I'll let them introduce themselves in a second here, but we're here to talk about the evolution of virtualization and where we're going, both where it came from, where we're going, and how things are progressing into the future with virtualization. So to kick things off, I'll let Bhavin kick it off with an introduction and tell us about your time at Portworx today.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. So I'm Bhavin Shah. I'm a part of the technical marketing team here at Portworx. I've been focused on early in my career, I did a lot of virtualization, moved to hybrid cloud deployments with working with partners like AWS and Azure, and then eventually onto Kubernetes. So I'm really excited about this conversation where we're going to talk about not just containers, but also virtual machines and how we bring them together. So looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you very much. And Peter, how about yourself?
Thanks. I'm Peter Lauterbach. I'm one of the product managers here on the OpenShift team at Red Hat. I've actually been in the virtualization space since the early formative days and when people were making VMs out of text files. I also have a fairly deep background in storage and scale, and probably way too much enterprise storage background as well.
Well, welcome to both of you. And I'd be remiss if I didn't introduce myself as well. Andy Gower. I'm hosting today's podcast or today's webinar, I should say. I'm the head of partner marketing at Portworx and delighted to drive this discussion with the team today. Let's start by going back to where we came from. And I want to kick off with a question, maybe starting with you, Peter. Can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing customers go through and really the evolution of that virtualization space from where we came from to where we are today?
Yeah, there's been a couple of changes, some more larger than others, more recent. Some are technical, some are more business related. But early in the day, there were lots of choices. Right, you could use vSphere, you could use KVM, you could use Hyper-V. There's been a fair amount of consolidation. Actually, for a short period of time, hyperconverged was all the rage, and everybody had an offering for that too. But we've seemed to have moved past that, and we're really now in this space where there's really two kind of streams happening at companies that we talk to. One is they've got a very large real estate of existing legacy and traditional virtualization. Those applications actually run the business. Yep. They're looking for alternatives there. And then many of the customers that we also talk to, especially on the OpenShift side, are doing a whole bunch of cloud native, which is applications that not only have to run on-prem, but also in the public cloud. And then there's actually sort of a suite, and I guess we'll talk about it in a little bit, a set of applications, actually the mix of both worlds, right? Mm-hmm. Or maybe it's a container-based, front end to an application that's talking to a database somewhere inside the customer's infrastructure. So it really is a very diverse set of deployments.
Yeah, and I know, Bhavin, you said you've been kind of front and center with this evolution as well, coming from VMware space days into container days. What have you seen in this evolution as we move from traditional to modern in the VM space?
Yeah, I think from my experience, right, I'm trying to draw parallels from my professional experiences. People liked the idea of containers and Kubernetes a lot, and we have seen a massive growth, right? Like if we look at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, we have been talking about how Kubernetes has crossed the chasm and now is in the mainstream, and everybody's building containers. But if you actually talk to customers, right, as Peter said, majority of their revenue generating applications are still running on virtual machines. So we'll obviously not get rid of virtual machines. We're just building new applications with containers. And I think if you look at some stats, right, the number of containers I expect it to run in production, I think that number just keeps going out in the future. I have a Gartner number in front of me, 65% of commercial off-the-shelf vendors will have software that runs just using containers, but that stat is for 2027. So there is a lot of runway between 2023 and 2027 where people still need to modernize their infrastructure and run virtual machine-based applications instead of doing all the heavy lift and refactoring the applications. As we all know, right, refactoring is not a simple exercise. So it will take time, and we need a better solution that can help us run both.
I think you took the words out of my mouth of where I wanted to go, which is, we're seeing the promise of containerization early on was, hey, just move everything to containers and lift and shift and, refactor and move forward with your entire state. But that's not the reality, is it? What we're seeing is that new applications maybe are being built, on containers, but those legacy applications you talked about, they can't go away. We need them to sit on VMs probably for 5 years, 10 years, maybe even longer, because they're so critical to the business.
Yeah, and some of those are actually, here's a .NET application that was written a decade ago. The guy that wrote it is retired. The team that has to maintain it is afraid to touch it. The best, the least risky option there is, hey, just leave it in a virtual machine and just run it somewhere.
Yep. No, and we see a lot of that, right? Like, even though the IT departments inside organizations are asked to modernize or go more towards that self-service approach, I think it's the applications that need to be modernized. And again, if it's not broken, if it's not worth the effort, why go through the whole journey or the whole painful journey of trying to refactor everything and finding whether I have a tool that can help me modernize my application, and if I give it a VM, it will give me a container, or do I have to go back to my code base and figure out a new way to deploy things? So yeah, it should be worth the effort.
So what has changed in the technology to have us start talking about, this possibility of running, VMs in a modern way? What is it that makes us say, hey, maybe there's a set of applications where you do containerize, you do lift and shift, you do, build net new, but you can also take advantage of these modern technologies for your VMs too? What's that shift in the market that we've seen?
So then actually there's a couple of interesting pieces to that, but one is my product, OpenShift Virtualization. As you know, everything we do here at Red Hat is based on open source upstream projects. Our upstream project KubeVirt is been around for about 7 years now. We've been generally available since OpenShift 4.5. So I think we just celebrated 3 years. And the important part is that it's Linux virtualization, right? So it's QEMU KVM under the hood, which is, you don't want to mess around with a new virtualization stack, right? So that's actually the virtualization stack that powers every Red Hat platform. RHEL, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Red Hat Virtualization or REV, OpenStack, and now OpenShift. And the other interesting part is the vast majority of hyperscalers actually run some form of KVM in their environment. When you spin up a virtual machine in their instance, or in your cloud instance, you're running KVM. What's new and different though is the ability to actually within an OpenShift, which is Kubernetes, within an OpenShift cluster, is actually declaratively spin up a virtual machine that is a good citizen of the OpenShift platform. So it gets its storage from a CSI provisioner. It gets its networking from a CNI compatible network, whether the one that comes with OpenShift or a different one. And it does all of the things that you would expect a virtual machine to do. In fact, in some ways, it's kind of undramatic, right? Which is, how many CPUs do you want? How much memory do you want? How many disks do you want? And what OS do you want to run, right? And there's a couple of things that we do to make it easier, right? Which is you can actually store images in the registry. We automatically download cloud-based images for RHEL. So there is a modern component to this where we make self-service and automation very available for virtual machines. But once you actually crack the virtual machine open and look at it, it looks like just like a KVM VM that you're running on another platform.
I know, and I think that was the one big wow moment for me, right? Learning more about KubeVirt last year, having not known about it before, it was like, oh, is this brand new? It's not even 1.0 yet. Should we trust running our virtual machines that revenue generating apps on this open source project? But then learning more about KubeVirt and specifically OpenShift virtualization, it's just Linux virtualization, as Peter said. Like, it's KVM. Like, this is what people have been using for years now. So it has been, I don't know, battle tested in some form or the other, and is ready to run your production workloads. But I really like the fact that it comes with that application, like the VM template catalog, right? Like, talking to customers, eventually in some form or fashion, when they were running VMware or Nutanix or any other virtualization stacks, they had a form of an image registry where they stored their golden templates that they want all their developers to use. If they want a Linux or CentOS or the Windows machine or a VM. I think having that functionality built into OpenShift with these validated or supported images published by Red Hat, I think that just makes it easier for people to consume things or have confidence that, okay, if they try this out, if they POC this, or if they commit to running OpenShift virtualization, they will get the same or similar features that they need to solve their business challenges.
Yeah, and just to put a finer point on it, and Bhavin, thank you for reminding me. So I'm also product manager for Red Hat Virtualization, which is our traditional product, and I've got customers running banks, airlines, and manufacturing floors, right? So if that's not business critical, I don't know what it is. But the other cool thing, and most people don't know this, but if you deploy an OpenShift cluster on bare metal, and you've got the right storage class set up, we will actually automatically download, hey, we found RHEL 8, RHEL 9 images, and update the templates. And so basically, if you wait, you just have to wait a little bit of time, like an hour after you deploy your cluster and install our operator, you can actually just start deploying RHEL 9 VMs automatically.
I know. Yeah, that's the self-service aspect that I really love, right? And just people who are like following Portworx for a while or following Red Hat OpenShift for a while and are familiar with Kubernetes terminologies, I think the integrations with the CSI standard, the CNI standard, makes it seamless. Like, if your developers were trying to learn containers and learn Kubernetes, and that's how they were thinking about building applications, they can still do that. Just have the target or the endpoint being a virtual machine object instead of a container or a pod running on OpenShift.
Correct.
And I wanted to just touch on that point. You brought it up for me, but the impact for developers here is this is a way to bring modern development practices into the virtualization space. It's not just for containers, it's for those traditional VMs, but you can bring those modern processes in, right, with this.
Absolutely. In fact, as Bhavin kind of alluded to, right, we do have some traditional, things that we kind of stole from the old way of doing things, like, hey, here's a VM template. We've actually, if I can tease something that's coming out very soon now, this idea of instance types, which is much more cloud friendly, right? Which is, hey, I need a VM, of this flavor, approximately this size, and this is the use case. Basically, 2 pieces of information, and boom, you get the right virtual machine configured the right way. But the other point is really this idea, excuse me, of being able to deploy applications or virtual machines in an automated fashion. And it shouldn't matter to the developer. Like, I shouldn't have to go ask somebody for permission for a VM or open a ticket somewhere. It's like, I've got an API. I can use the CLI, I can use an API, or I can use the web console. But as long as I have permissions and disk space and the right capabilities on my cluster as a user, I can use virtual machines in the standard traditional way, like, hey, I run a database in it. I can use virtual machines in CI/CD pipelines, which is, automatically generating and building VMs on the fly, use them for a test, and then, ephemerally get rid of them. Or if I want to do something even more creative, right, which is, there's a lot of tooling on the OpenShift platform, like observability and using things like service mesh, which gives you more insight into what's happening in security. You can actually use virtual machines in those contexts as well, right? So developer pipelines, which is Tecton, service mesh, which is Istio, all of the virtual machines are compatible with all of the parts of OpenShift.
And this is something new that I learned, right? I didn't know it. OpenShift virtualization already supported service meshes, right? Service meshes are so cool, right? Like you can do things like traffic routing, or you can analyze, figure out bottlenecks in your application infrastructure. I think this just opens up another use case. Like, yeah, this is super cool. Instead of having to buy third-party tools for your virtualization stack and having to pay extra and just figure out how to use those tools, I think having a unified solution definitely helps.
Yeah, the way we say it is, OpenShift is batteries included but swappable, right? Yeah. So if you like our service mesh, great. If you want a different thing, so we have partners like Dynatrace that are part of our ecosystem. We try to give everybody equal access, right? We try not to play favorites, but in reality, there are partners that we have closer relationships with and better engineering relationships, like Portworx.
But I think that's a good tie-in to kind of this slide, which talks about, what are people thinking about when they deploy workloads, and it's about consistency in terms of security and resiliency and cost and speed of deployment and scalability. And I think those are all things that both Portworx and OpenShift provide by giving that enterprise-grade platform to start off with. And just talk a little bit about how important it is to have those built into a platform instead of having to piecemeal these into a platform on your own. Sure.
Well, the security one, everybody was paranoid about that originally. And then all of a sudden we had, build chain, vulnerabilities, which, that really freaked everybody out. And that was a couple of years ago. So you'll see in the OpenShift world and the Red Hat world in general, attestation of the items that you build or things that partners build for you, right? So our catalog is secure. Anything that you build locally is secure and everything is all signed. And then this idea of I can deploy that at scale, right? So the speed of deployment is also important, which is, in OpenShift, everything is, hey, you just go tell it what it's declarative, right? You just go say what you want to have happen. I want these namespaces, I want this storage, and I want these VMs running these things, and it will go make that happen, right? So in a lot of cases, we can actually use, and Portworx is a very good example of this. There's a lot of acceleration that are actually built into partners' products that OpenShift can take advantage of, right? So speed of cloning and things like that. It's not like the virtualization layer is doing all the heavy lifting. It's actually benefiting from all of the, whether it's storage acceleration from cloning, whether it's hardware compute acceleration from GPUs or SIROV, virtual machines can take advantage of all of that. And I guess one last point about scalability, that's probably the other one that everybody asks about, which is, hey, can I run it's cute. You create a small cluster, you put a couple of VMs on it, that's nice. Okay, but we've actually got an entire awesome performance and scale team that makes sure that, hey, here's a 100-node bare metal cluster running 3,000 VMs, with 50 nodes of storage, and it actually gets bigger from there.
And I want you to save that thought. I'm going to come back to talk about use cases here in a minute, but Bhavin, yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts on what Peter was talking about, especially around data and storage and how it's critical to have that kind of consistency in the virtualization world, not just in the container world.
Yeah, no, and like before I start my answer, right, I want to talk about another report, like from the community, the 2023 State of Production Kubernetes report. I think it's about to come out, but we saw a couple of stats from that, and one that caught my eye was they interviewed like 350 organizations. 86% of them said that they want to truly unify their containerized and VM workloads on a single infrastructure platform. So this is becoming that top of mind priority for so many organizations out there. And to go back to storage, right, which was your original question, Portworx was built from the ground up for containers and for Kubernetes. So if you wanted to use us for running or providing storage to your vSphere VMs, our answer would have been no. But now with OpenShift virtualization or just with KubeVirt, since it follows all the same standards as we said earlier, right? It complies with CSI standards and it can ask for persistent volumes using PVC claims. Portworx can be that unified storage layer. So we can provide you with the same consistent set of features. If you need block storage, file storage, if you need autopilot capabilities, for automated storage capacity management. Portworx can not just provide that for containers, which we have been doing for years, but also extend or expand those capabilities to support your virtual machine-based workloads. So just because you started or you are thinking about running virtual machines on Kubernetes, you don't have to go and find a different solution, and hopefully that works, as well as your container-based solution work with using Portworx. So we are that truly unified solution. Andy, to answer your original question.
Yeah, and now I'll come back to the kind of the next topic that we hinted at, which is, what are those typical use cases that we see? What's the journey that a customer goes through? Because we know that we talked about at the beginning, no customer is going all the way to containers today. No customers, sticking 100% with virtualization. All these companies are somewhere in the middle, and they're all in different stages of the journey. So talk about what we've seen where folks are on the leading edge, and also some customers that are maybe slower adopters, but they're looking at this as a key component of their strategy. I'll start with you on this one, Peter.
Sure. The interesting part is virtualization kind of doesn't have any particular niche that is favored over one over the other. Like I said, even with our traditional products, folks are running airlines and national banks and manufacturing floors that span the globe with this product. In our particular case, we were early in the financial services space. So we actually, that customer was doing, persistent desktops, that needed to scale and be deployed throughout their organization. But that's just one particular use case. We've got others that we can talk about. And by the way, many of these customers have talked publicly at Red Hat Summit usually, sometimes at OpenShift Commons. So another one would be, actually it's a public reference, which is Sahib Binden in the e-commerce space. They actually migrated all of their VMs off of their existing virtualization platform onto OpenShift, and actually have multiple large bare metal clusters that are essentially replicating the work. And their use case is actually pretty interesting, because it originally started as, hey, I just want to re-platform my IT. Then all of a sudden they discovered, as Bhavin said, oh, I could build a new cloud native platform, new cloud native app on the same platform, or start modernizing this VM application. And the way they actually run is each site handles about 45% of their traffic, and they burst the last 10% up into a public cloud provider. There's a couple that we've worked together on. We can't use the names publicly here, otherwise, but I wish we could. But I'll briefly say, right, another financial services company, which is, looking for an alternative and aggressively moving off. I would say they're at the very leading edge, right? There's no, and we do have talked to customers that are they go between angry and anxious and nervous. But, they're very motivated to move to a new platform. Some of the other customers that are much larger tend to be much more deliberate and take their time and, hey, we'll look at this thing. And a good example would be the Israel Ministry of Defense, which presented at our last summit, which was they did an 18-month POC with our product and took a time to get over there. And now they actually have, their VMs as a service. They're actually spinning up on VMs in OpenShift.
And I think the important point, and then Bob, and I'll ask her kind of what you've seen in the field and where this has been implemented, is the big thing we're giving customers that customers get with a modern virtualization approach is that flexibility. It's the, hey, I have this event and I need to move today, or it's the, hey, I'm just willing to dip my toe in. I want to try something new. I've got this team that's kind of doing innovative things. We want to try that in this little pocket, but it really allows you to move at the speed you want to move within the OpenShift world, and not have to commit fully to VMs or containers. You get to go at your own pace. Talk about what you've seen with customers who've started this journey. So
as Peter alluded, right, like there are customers and prospects that are on that anxious to angry journey about, and they're experimenting with OpenShift virtualization as maybe an alternative. So there are people that are or companies that are going head first, like, okay, I need to replace my estate and I'm looking for a solution. Maybe in 6 months I'll be completely switched over to OpenShift virtualization. And then there are conversations that I've been having at trade shows, right? Like, for example, this year they might not get as much budget as they did last year, so they're looking for other options, right? How can they get the most bang for their buck? If they're not going to renew all of their licenses from their traditional stack, how can they use some of that money with some of that reduced budget and figure out a way to still support all the application teams that they did, but then do it in an efficient way? And this goes back to having that unified stack, right? You're not investing in two different stacks. Having one single stack to run all kinds of applications definitely helps you use your money wisely. And this is like the next customer I'm talking about is not running OpenShift virtualization right now, but they have over the years, right, being in OpenShift and Portworx customers, they have figured out they have built internal development platforms or IDPs. It's not based on Backstage. This is something homegrown. But whenever a new developer joins the team, right, they can just request for a namespace as a service. And then a different customer has done like a small cluster as a service. So it's no longer going back to the good old days where you had to like open up tickets and wait for somebody to provision your storage and make sure all the VLANs or networks are properly mapped and give you compute capacity. Now organizations have modernized enough that they can make everything self-service. So having that unified stack definitely helps with that approach as well, right? Like if I'm a developer who has never used containers, I want to write my code and eventually deploy it on a virtual machine, the same automation should work for them as well. So I think it's early. Like I wouldn't say like just this is my personal opinion, that it's not something that has crossed the chasm, but it's heavily going towards that direction.
And you alluded to this at the end there, but there's a good chunk of people where Kubernetes is still it's scary, it's new, it's a tough technology to adopt. It's something that is a big leap from what we have known traditionally. Help me assuage their fears a little bit. Talk about how modern virtualization is that easy on ramp to the future without having to completely start from square zero.
Yeah, and some of those things that we love to demo are exactly that, right? Hey, here's some new cool stuff: declarative, self-healing. Just check code into a repository and VM starts showing up somewhere. But in reality, and Bhavin, you and I have talked about this in the past, there's some basic table stakes you need to do for VMs, which is I need to protect my data, right? I got to back it up and restore it, and God forbid. Actually, let me say one other thing. A lot of the rules for building distributed applications don't go away just because you're using OpenShift and Kubernetes, right? In fact, they become slightly more important, right? So how big, blast radius, how big do I make my clusters? How often, I need an RPO and an RTO of this type of thing for this business critical application. Those still apply, right? So I have an application that runs my business. And if my data center turns into a smoke, and gets flooded or whatever happens, how do I run that application somewhere else, right? So the things that I think that Bhavin's talked about, but I actually want to highlight is getting storage is the simple part, right? The big part of enterprise storage is data protection and disaster recovery, and you got to be able to not only do that once or twice. You got to do it regularly, you got to do it consistently, and you have to do it at scale. And Portworx absolutely has done that for OpenShift and OpenShift virtualization. And
Bhavin, I'll pop this slide up and let you talk a little more into that. What is it that Portworx is doing specifically with Red Hat to give that better together story for modern virtualization?
Yeah, so I really love this slide, right, that we usually use in our presentations. So Portworx, being that cloud native storage layer, doesn't depend on any kind of infrastructure or any kind of specific hardware. So even though we love to work with pure storage arrays, if you have anything else from the ecosystem, if you are running on bare metal nodes or even in the cloud with bare metal instances, Portworx can run on top of your OpenShift clusters itself and give you all these capabilities. So it makes you truly platform and infrastructure agnostic. But then, as Peter said, right, like there are table stakes. Like, okay, you need to give your developers some form of storage, and that's easy. it comes the day two operations is when it becomes really critical, and that's where whenever we are talking to virtualization admins, things like vMotion that just made sense to them. Everybody had that aha moment when they first started with VMware of just VMs moving between nodes in the cluster by a click of a button. I think that's the first thing I looked for when I was trying OpenShift virtualization. Like, does it give me live migration? And yes, it does. Like you go to the OpenShift web console, you select the VM and you hit a button and it just moves between nodes. And because of Portworx, what we can enable is you can move that across failure domains, right? Across racks, across data centers, across availability zones if you're doing this in the cloud. So you can live migrate your virtual machines between these different fault domains that you have created for yourselves. High availability, right? If a node fails or an AZ fails, what happens then? What happens to your virtual machines? If you're familiar with how vSphere works, right? It just gets restarted on a different node in your cluster. The same behavior exists here as well. So some of those, when we are having these discussions with prospects, right? These discussions make them at ease. And they're like, okay, now let's talk. Let's see how we can do POCs. One other thing like that jumps out to me is the synchronous and asynchronous disaster recovery. Nobody goes into production without having a DR solution. Like you need to have a plan on how you will bring your applications back up in case of a disaster event. We all saw crazy videos of New York City getting flooded a few weeks back. And yeah, I wouldn't want to have like a basement data center or racks at the ground level. So how do you deal with or plan for scenarios like that, right? And having Portworx running with OpenShift virtualization definitely helps you build that async, or even a 3 data center infrastructure where you can do sync across different or across your same region clusters, and then you can have an asynchronous copy as well. So like maybe New York City to Jersey City, and then have one third location or a tertiary location sitting in Texas or California where you can bring your applications online.
So I know we're pushing up at the end of our conversation here. I want to leave time for some closing thoughts. We've talked about a lot of things today. We talked about the role of modern virtualization, the things we can get with a modern virtualization platform from OpenShift, and what Portworx brings to the table. Kind of that journey that customers are going through, whether they're at the leading edge of the journey or at the beginning of the journey. Portworx and OpenShift provides them with that optionality, that flexibility to take that journey at their pace. Just want to leave some time for quick parting thoughts. Bob, and I'll start with you on the closing thoughts here.
No, like for me, I think this is an exciting evolution that everybody should be paying attention to. Like, yeah, we have a minority of organizations using this, but there are a lot of organizations that are actively POCing it, trying it out, and are ready to jump into running VMs the new way.
Yeah, and thank you, Bhavin. Yeah, the real power here, right, is we think OpenShift is awesome, but like it can't do everything, right? We know that. And that's why Red Hat has a very strong ecosystem with lots of partners, both storage, networking, and all sorts of other associated things. And Portworx has worked very closely with us. I like to say it's engineer to engineer conversations that I actually broker, and then I get out of the way. Right, so the smart people can actually make these things work together, and that ecosystem, and that's not a one-off thing, right? Like that has to, there's new versions of OpenShift that come out, 3 times a year. We want to make sure that all the things that we do are compatible with the way Portworx does, and vice versa. The last thing I want to say is about this idea of the more modern way of GitOps and declarative and code in a repo doing magic. That's fine, but a lot of things that you still need, like, hey, I need sysprep to create a VM. I need Cloud Init. Maybe I have PowerShell that runs inside the guest. All of those things that you do today on your existing virtualization platform will work in a virtual machine on OpenShift.